There is a specific kind of cold that settles over Middle Tennessee right around the end of November. It is not the deep, bone-chilling freeze I remember from my childhood in Ohio, but it is a quiet, creeping frost that coats the grass in the backyard and leaves a thin layer of ice on the bird bath. I was standing by the back door a few mornings ago, holding my mug, just watching the way the early light hit that frost. Eleanor has a small garden out there, mostly herbs and a few late-blooming perennials. She is meticulous about it. Every year there is a very narrow window of time, usually just a few days, where she has to make a decision to cover certain plants or prune them back before the true cold sets in. If she misses that window, the frost gets into the roots, and the plant does not just lose its leaves. It loses its ability to come back in the spring. The damage becomes permanent. I stood there watching the frozen ground, and I could not help but think about how perfectly that mirrors what happens inside our own bodies. We spend most of our lives thinking we have endless seasons ahead of us, endless chances to repair and recover. But the older I get and the more I pay attention to the quiet signals my body sends me, the more I realize that aging is not a slow, steady decline. It is a series of closing windows, and the most critical window of all, the one almost nobody talks about until it is completely shut, happens right after we turn 60. I am 77 years old now. Most days I feel clear and capable, but I distinctly remember the year I turned 60. At the time, I thought I was doing fine. I was still working in publishing, still dealing with the daily stress of deadlines and meetings, still driving long hours and drinking too much bad office coffee. I thought the slight heavy feeling in my legs and the stiffness in my shoulders were just the normal taxes you pay for carrying 60 years of life. Everyone around me reinforced that idea. Men my age would joke about falling apart, about how you just have to get used to everything hurting. I accepted it. I bought into the illusion that getting older simply meant getting weaker, slower, and more fragile. I did not know then what I know now. I did not know that at 60, my body was not just naturally winding down. It was standing at a biological crossroads. It was waiting for instructions on whether to keep repairing itself or to start permanently shutting down the machinery. I missed that window for a long time, and I paid for it in aches, in brain fog, and in a terrifying loss of vitality that I almost accepted as my permanent fate. It took Eleanor getting sick to finally shake me out of my complacency. I have mentioned before that we went through a very dark period with her health. Those months spent sitting in uncomfortable chairs in brightly lit hospital corridors changed the architecture of my mind. When you watch someone you love lose their physical independence, even temporarily, the abstract concept of mortality becomes a very concrete reality in your living room. When the crisis passed and we brought her home, I found myself looking at my own hands, my own knees, my own reflection in the mirror, with a deep sense of suspicion. I realized that if I did not figure out what was happening under my own skin, I was not going to be strong enough to take care of her if she needed me again. I was not going to be the grandfather I wanted to be for my 3 grandchildren. That fear, that deep, hollow fear of becoming a burden, drove me to my notebooks. I retired, set up my leather chair by the window in my study, and I started reading everything I could find about what actually happens to our cells when we cross that threshold into our 60s. My daughter Rebecca is a nutritionist, and she has always been patient with my endless questions. My son Daniel is an engineer, and he constantly tells me to stop overthinking and just look at the structural integrity of things. I took both of their advice. I started looking at the human body as an engineering problem tied to nutrition and time. I spent afternoons poring over dense academic papers, tracing lines with a wooden pencil, trying to translate the heavy medical jargon into something a layman like me could actually grasp. I was looking for the root cause of the decline. I did not want to read about managing symptoms. I wanted to know why the symptoms appeared in the first place. That is when I found myself falling down the rabbit hole of cellular regeneration. I started reading about the specific mechanisms that govern how our bodies rebuild tissue, heal wounds, and fight off the slow decay of time. What I found forced me to completely reevaluate my entire understanding of aging. I had always assumed that as we get older, our cells just naturally get weaker and die off, and there is nothing we can do about it. But the reality I discovered in those papers was far more complex and far more urgent. I learned about our internal repair crew. I am talking about stem cells. Now, I am not talking about the controversial treatments or the expensive injections you hear about on the news. I am talking about the adult stem cells that have lived inside your bone marrow since the day you were born. When we are in our 20s and 30s, these cells are highly active. They act like a dedicated emergency response team. The moment there is inflammation in a joint, a tear in a muscle, or damage in an organ, chemical signals are sent through the bloodstream. These stem cells rush out of the marrow, travel to the site of the damage, and literally transform into the specific type of cell needed to make the repair. They are the reason a young person can twist an ankle on a Friday and be walking fine by Monday. But here is the terrifying part, and the part that kept me awake at night after I first read it. I discovered that when we hit our late 50s and cross into our 60s, the number of active stem cells circulating in our blood drops off a cliff. It is not a gentle slope. It is a dramatic, sudden reduction. But the crucial detail, the detail that changes everything, is that these stem cells do not disappear. They do not die. They simply go dormant. The biological environment in an older body becomes noisy. The chronic, low-grade inflammation that builds up over decades acts like static on a radio line. The distress signals from your aching knees and your tired organs are still being sent, but the stem cells sitting in your bone marrow can no longer hear them through the static. So, they go to sleep. They stay locked in the marrow, inactive, while your body slowly breaks down around them. The more I read about this dormancy, the more I understood the concept of the window. I found papers discussing what happens if these cells stay dormant for too long. If they remain asleep and unutilized as we move through our 60s and into our 70s, they begin to undergo a process called senescence. They essentially turn into zombie cells. They are not dead, but they are no longer capable of dividing or repairing anything. Instead, they sit there and secrete inflammatory toxins that damage the healthy cells around them. This is the window. There is a specific period of time, starting around age 60, where your repair crew is asleep but not yet permanently broken. If you can find a way to wake them up, to clear the static and force them back into circulation, you can dramatically alter the trajectory of your aging. But if you ignore them, if you just accept the decline and let them transition into senescence, the window closes. The damage, just like the frost on Eleanor's roots, becomes permanent. When I finally understood this, I felt a physical weight on my chest. I was already in my 70s. I realized I was standing on the very edge of that window, and I had spent the last decade completely oblivious to it. I needed to know how to wake them up. I needed to know what signals I could send into my own bloodstream to coax those dormant cells out of the marrow before they turned toxic. I spent weeks chasing dead ends. I read about exotic supplements that cost a fortune and rigorous physical regimens that someone my age could never safely attempt. But I kept digging because I knew there had to be a biological trigger, something built into our evolutionary code. The answer I eventually found was so simple and so profoundly tied to our daily rhythms that it made me angry I had not seen it sooner. The trigger to reactivate these cells, the key to keeping the window open, is completely dependent on how you handle the first 2 hours of your day. To understand why the morning is so critical, I had to understand what happens to the body at night. When we sleep, provided we are not digesting a heavy late-night meal, our body enters a state of natural fasting. Without the burden of processing food, the body diverts its energy toward a deep cellular cleanup process. It starts sweeping away the metabolic waste and the misfolded proteins that cause that static I mentioned earlier. This process is the prerequisite for healing. It lowers the baseline inflammation. By the time you wake up, your body is in a state of quiet anticipation. The static is at its lowest point. The communication lines between your tissues and your bone marrow are as clear as they will ever be. The dormant stem cells are primed, waiting for a signal to move. Every single morning, you have a micro window to trigger a release. But I look back at my own life and I realized with a sinking heart exactly what I had been doing during that crucial morning window for the last 40 years. I would wake up, walk into the kitchen, and immediately pour a bowl of cereal, or toast a bagel, or drink a large glass of orange juice. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was fueling up for the day, but I was doing the exact opposite of what my aging biology required. The moment you introduce carbohydrates, sugars, or heavy proteins into your system first thing in the morning, your pancreas spikes insulin. That insulin spike acts like a massive biological alarm bell that instantly shuts down the overnight cleanup process. The inflammation begins to rise immediately. The communication lines get flooded with static again. The stem cells in the marrow, which were just beginning to stir, receive the signal that the repair phase is over and the storage phase has begun. They go right back to sleep. I had been slamming the window shut on my own cellular repair every single morning before the sun was even fully up. Realizing this was a bitter pill to swallow, I had to acknowledge that much of the physical decline I had experienced in my 60s was not just the inevitable passage of time. It was the direct result of my own daily choices. But the beautiful thing about the human body is its resilience. Even late in the game, it desperately wants to heal if you just get out of its way. The research I was analyzing pointed clearly to a specific protocol. It was not enough to just delay breakfast. Fasting alone clears the static, but to actually mobilize the dormant stem cells, to pull them out of the marrow and into the bloodstream where they can do their work, you need specific environmental and chemical triggers applied while the body is still in that fasted state. I started experimenting on myself. I completely changed the architecture of my mornings. The very first change I made had nothing to do with food or drink. It had to do with light. I found papers explaining how the circadian rhythm, the internal clock that governs our biology, is deeply tied to stem cell mobilization. When the specific spectrum of morning sunlight hits the receptors in your eyes, it sends a signal to the brain, which then sends a cascade of signals down to the bone marrow, telling it that a new cycle has begun. For years, I would spend my first waking hours entirely indoors, under artificial lights, reading the newspaper or watching the morning news. I was denying my body the fundamental environmental cue it needed to start the repair process. So, I changed the rule. Now, regardless of the temperature outside, the moment I wake up, I put on my coat and I step out onto the back porch. I do not look at my phone. I do not turn on the television. I just stand there for 10 or 15 minutes, letting the natural morning light hit my eyes. I watch the frost on the garden. I let my brain register that the day has started. It sounds almost too simple to be effective, but the biological reality is that this light exposure is the first key turning in the lock. I want to take a brief pause here. If you have been listening to this and you find yourself recognizing your own habits in my mistakes, I would ask you to consider subscribing to the channel. Many of you who watch these videos regularly have not clicked that button yet. Doing so simply helps us continue to have these quiet, honest conversations about the realities of aging. It costs nothing, and it means a great deal to me and to the work we are trying to do here. Thank you for considering it. After my time outside in the light, I come back into the kitchen for the second and perhaps most crucial part of the morning trigger. I mentioned earlier that I had to stop eating my heavy breakfasts. I had to extend the overnight fast. But simply fasting is passive. I needed an active trigger. The research I found pointed toward a specific class of compounds found in nature that have a profound ability to stimulate endothelial stem cells. These are the cells responsible for repairing the lining of your blood vessels, improving circulation, and delivering oxygen to your aging tissues. The compounds are called flavonols and specific types of polyphenols, and the most accessible, potent source of these compounds is something I already had in my kitchen, but I was using it completely wrong. I am talking about dark, bitter coffee and pure, unprocessed cacao. I used to drink my coffee loaded with milk and sugar, effectively neutralizing any benefit and spiking my insulin. Now my routine is rigid. I brew a strong cup of black coffee. The polyphenols in the dark roast act as a mild stressor on the cells, a process called hormesis, which tells the body to strengthen its defenses and keeps the cleanup process running. But the true catalyst is the cacao. I take a heaping spoonful of raw organic cacao powder, the bitter, dark powder that has not been stripped of its nutrients by processing, and I stir it directly into the black coffee. I also add a half teaspoon of true Ceylon cinnamon to ensure my blood sugar remains absolutely flat, preventing any accidental insulin spikes that would close the repair window. This dark, earthy mixture is my morning protocol. I drink it slowly while I sit in my leather chair and read. I do not consume any calories, no food, no dairy, nothing that requires digestion, for at least 3 to 4 hours after I wake up. I combine the clear static of the fasting state with the specific chemical triggers of the cacao and the coffee, and the environmental trigger of the morning light. I am actively trying to coax those dormant repairmen out of my bone marrow while the window is still open. I will admit the first few weeks were difficult. My body was so addicted to the morning sugar rush that I felt a dull ache in my head and a persistent grumbling in my stomach. I complained to Eleanor about it. I almost quit twice. But Daniel reminded me to stick to the structural logic of what I was doing, and Rebecca encouraged me to let my metabolic machinery adjust. I pushed through the discomfort. And it was not a sudden, miraculous transformation. Anyone my age who promises you a miracle is selling you something you do not need. The changes I experienced were subtle, quiet, and profound. It started with my mental clarity. The deep fog that used to blanket my mind until noon began to lift earlier and earlier. I found myself able to focus on complex reading materials for hours without feeling the familiar mental exhaustion. Then, the physical changes followed. The heavy, dragging sensation in my legs when I walked down the driveway to get the mail started to fade. The stiffness in my shoulders, the chronic ache that I had accepted as my permanent companion since I turned 60, did not disappear entirely. I am still an old man, but the volume of the pain was turned down significantly. I felt a steady, calm energy that carried me through the day without the sharp crashes I used to suffer in the late afternoons. When I eventually went in for my annual physical, I did not say much to my doctor about my new routine. I just let him run the standard panels. When the results came back, he sat across from me with a puzzled look on his face. He told me that my markers for systemic inflammation, the numbers that had been steadily climbing for the past 10 years, had dropped to levels he usually sees in men a decade younger. He told me my cardiovascular markers looked remarkably stable. I just nodded and smiled. I knew I had not found the fountain of youth. I had simply stopped fighting my own biology. I had finally learned how to keep the window open long enough for my body to do the work it desperately wanted to do. I watch my friends now, men and women in their late 60s and 70s, and it breaks my heart to see how many of them are simply surrendering to the decline. They sit in their recliners, they eat their sweet cereals in the morning, they avoid the cold outside air, and they complain about how everything hurts. They are letting the static build up. They are letting their repair crews sleep through the emergency. They do not realize that the window is closing, and once those cells fully transition into senescence, it becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to reverse the damage. I often think about my father back in Ohio. He was a good man, a hard worker, but he aged terribly. By the time he was my current age, he could barely walk to the end of his driveway. He lived his whole life eating heavy meals first thing in the morning, drinking his coffee out of habit rather than purpose, and treating his body like a machine that simply ran out of parts. I watched him shrink into his chair, defeated by his own biology. I carry that memory with me every morning when I step out into the cold Tennessee light. I do this routine not because I am afraid of dying. At 77, you make your peace with the end of the story. I do this because I am terrified of fading away while I am still alive. I do this because I want to be present, capable, and useful for Eleanor, for Rebecca, for Daniel, and for the grandchildren who still want me to play in the yard with them. Aging is not a disease you can cure. It is a natural process of wearing down. But the speed at which you wear down and the quality of the years you have left are profoundly influenced by the choices you make every single morning. The time after 60 is not a time to give up. It is the most critical time to pay attention. It is the time when the margin for error disappears. You cannot afford to ignore the signals anymore. You cannot afford to shut down your own repair mechanisms out of habit or convenience. Tomorrow morning the sun will come up, the house will be quiet, and you will have a choice. You can follow the path of least resistance, pour the sugar, eat the heavy food, and let the dormant cells in your bones slip further into permanent sleep. Or you can step outside into the light. You can embrace the fast. You can brew the dark coffee, add the bitter cacao, and send a clear, undeniable signal into your own bloodstream that you are not done yet. You can choose to keep the window open. The frost is always coming, eventually. But you do not have to let it settle into your roots before your time. I am going to go sit by the window now. The light is getting stronger and my coffee is ready. I hope you take this to heart. I hope you find the discipline to change the way you start your day. I will see you next time.